Hi, everyone. This is Jaime Alejandro, and you're listening to the Arts Calling podcast, the place where I interview hardworking independent creatives in the literary, visual, and performing arts. Today, I'm delighted to have a return guest and a brand new guest together, and we're going to talk about collaboration. So let me introduce you because today I'm delighted to be Arts Calling Maria C. Palmer, friend of the show, coming back, as well as Ruthie Robbins, her co-author in their latest work, On the Rocks, the Prima Donna Story. So let me tell you about our guests. Maria Costanzo Palmer is an author and grant writer. Growing up as the oldest child of an award-winning restaurateur, Maria unexpectedly became a daughter of the incarcerated. This experience ignited an interest in working for Get on the Bus, a nonprofit dedicated to uniting children with their incarcerated parents. A former host on LA Talk Radio, Maria was recently featured on Food and Beverage Magazine Live and has made a number of media appearances. You can find Maria on Facebook and Instagram at Joe Costanzo Prima Donna and on Twitter at Maria C. Palmer. For more information, visit mariacpalmer.com. And Ruthie Robbins is an award-winning educator who worked for the Montour School District in the suburbs of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and for Johns Hopkins University Talent Development Secondary. Ruthie grew up in The Rocks, but now teaches English language arts and music in Buffalo, New York. Best known as co-creator of a popular interdisciplinary unit for Pittsburgh's Kennywood Park, Ruthie is currently working on other books and is preparing to launch The Writing Factory Online, a comprehensive writing program for middle schools. And lastly, before we start the conversation, feel free to check out episode 109. Maria and I spoke at length about On the Rocks, and I think that you'll appreciate some of the backstory that we were able to uncover, and I think it might provide a bit more context. And so, without further delay, let's give Maria and Ruthie a call. Well, thank you both so much for taking the time to do this. I'm really excited because this is the first of a kind for Arts Calling. We're going to specifically talk about collaboration and the creative process of bringing together two minds to put out one work. And I guess the work in question is On the Rocks. Maria, could you do me the great favor of setting up the book just so that we can kind of get the ball rolling that way?
Sure, absolutely. So the book started as a family history project some 17 plus years ago, and it started at a really dark time for my family. The book is about my father, who's the main protagonist, and his rise and fall in the restaurant industry. And unfortunately, every great story has sometimes a sharp fall, and his ended with a stint in federal prison. And our family really kind of lost all that we had. And so I knew that the restaurant times were very fond in his mind. So I started this project, which I did not know at the time was going to become this book, as just asking him very simple questions. Tell me a story about a time where a celebrity came in. Tell me a story about whenever you thought something was going to happen and something very unexpected happened. And that's how it all started. And then how it all continued, I kind of got as far as I could in the process and transcribed everything. And I really didn't know what was going to happen next. But I have this really wonderful AP English teacher, Ruthie, at the time, Ruthie Dines, but now Ruthie Robbins. And she had known that I was working on this project, and she kind of came in as I'm going to call her writing angel. I could call her so many things, but we'll call her the writing angel. Mm-hmm. And she really helped to steer it with the help of her writers group in Buffalo into putting it into the format of a book and a narrative story and making the decision that it should all be done in my father's voice. So that's how it all kind of kicked off. Many years later, I think we worked together probably at least 7, maybe 10 years at this point, side by side. So we know each other pretty well, I would say, at this point. And it's just been an incredible process. I never knew that I was going to write a book. And I also never really understood the relationship between a co-authorship. And it's just been so much fun, I would
Wonderful.
say.
Now, Ruthie, we're having the pleasure of listening to your perspective this time on this one, because last time we got a lot of Maria's background on her journey into finding the right way into this story. Even though it's her own story, her family story, there's a lot to uncover. And I'm curious for you, how you make your way to getting to the heart of the story, and of course this realization that the story should be told through her dad's perspective, because I think that was a really powerful decision.
It it was. So when Maria gave me she had a finished manuscript and first asked if I'd edit. And she wrote it in her own voice. And there are some parts that are not in the book anymore now because of that. And it's some of the best parts of her original book, but I just had a feeling it was a little unbalanced, because the early restaurant years were years when Maria was just a baby. So it was more hearsay. And I felt like that could be stronger and we needed more information. And then I felt like her voice at times struggles with Mean Girls, all kinds of things that go on. It's like, probably didn't fit in the same story. So I suggested, let's write it in the third person, all-knowing narrator. That seemed better. And so we did that for a while. And there was something stiff about it. Not that a lot of published works, especially I love rock biographies and things like that. A lot of times it's like, oh, this is written and it's kind of stiff. I love the story, but not the way it's written. So we tried that, and it sounded like an English teacher was writing it. I just didn't like it. And then someone in my writers group named Lisa Redman, if anyone is a fan of mysteries, excellent writer. She had her first book published around 2017. Now I think she's on her 8th, so she's become very popular. But she just said one day, why don't you try writing in Joe's voice? So on the way home from the writers group, I'd always call Maria. And I said, how about that? And she said, sure, let's try it. And it became so much more fun because her dad is a bigger than life character. I don't know, it just became fun instead of a struggle. So that's what we did. And for me, I grew up on the street where the prima donna was located. And so that's my neighborhood. That's my town. I love McKees Rocks. I still do, even though if you Google, you'll see it's listed as one of the most dangerous places in Pittsburgh, but it's just home to me. And so I knew everything about that town. And my sister and I saw when the restaurant first opened, he was only serving like 8 or 10 dinners a night, but we tried it because, that was our neighborhood. Wow. And it was excellent. We tried to spread the word by word of mouth. There was no Facebook or anything then, but we became steady customers. And then I got to know Joe. Then down the line, Maria was in my 7th grade class, and then later my high school class. And then she and my son both moved to California, happened to be about 8 miles apart. So they stayed close and we stayed close, and we were always in touch. But I grew up with a lot of the characters in the Rocks. Joe and I are the same age. So it was fun. I was involved. I understood everybody, and it was a great collaboration.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I imagine that it creates a bit of tension in terms of how Maria may have perceived some of the happenings, whereas you being a contemporary of her father's, you kind of had to figure out a middle ground. Was that part of the conversation, or how did you guys work through that? Because I feel like that might be the most disparate thing in terms of perspective, right? So like, how did you guys meet in the middle there, if there was like a moment where you guys realized that, that's how you were going to work?
There were moments like that, but it was more taking from each other than compromising, like adding. Mm-hmm. She'd add her perspective being inside. Sometimes Maria was my waitress. And then I'd give the perspective as a customer and friend of other customers and, person who knew somebody. I just have to say this because it's timely. Tonight's the big Bills game. And so most people know that Damar Hamlin number 3, almost died on the field last year. That's an international story. His mother's daycare, for which they raised over $9 million, is exactly behind the prima donna.
Oh, wow.
The two buildings face each other. Again, on my little street where I grew up that no one ever heard of, so that was just kind of a cool little tangent there. But I don't know if anyone will even believe me. Maria and I never had a bad moment. There were things that had to be said either way. Sometimes I was busy and I knew I was lagging behind, and Maria had, trying to get this book, especially before her dad's second kidney transplant. And so she just is gentle about things. And sometimes I didn't like certain things, but there was not tension. And that might be hard to believe over all the years. And I need to say this. We were talking one day, we mostly talked, then texted, then emailed. The emails were the manuscript going back and forth between us. We were on the phone and she said, I wonder how many texts and calls we've had. I said, well, I can tell you the emails. And so I was just pressing forward while we were on the phone. There were 11,000 emails in 1 year. And I didn't even feel like we were doing that much on email.
We didn't.
My goodness.
We really didn't do a lot of emailing.
Yeah.
It's funny. I'm thinking about, there's a couple of pieces of the book that I'm just so grateful that I had Ruthie really intimately involved in. And the first of which is one of our opening chapters, which originally was going to be our first chapter. And then we just sort of decided to title it on The Rocks. And it sets up this flashback scene. It's how the book essentially opens. And it's basically what McKee's Rocks was like before it got onto one of those terrible lists. What it was like during the 50s and 60s, whenever it was a booming steel town. And I think that one of the, I guess, positive consequences about the book and calling it On the Rocks is that a lot of people have moved out, but they've kind of kept their roots within Pittsburgh and within the Rocks. And when they see the title of this book, it reminds them of home, because McKee's Rocks is also known collectively as the Rocks to local people. And one of the pieces of feedback that I've gotten so many times is how much love and adoration people have for that opening preface of the Rocks, because it brings them back to this nostalgic time of a simpler place and a time where, they grew up and they went to these community church fairs, and, they spent Friday nights in different areas and skating rinks, and, a much simpler but much more beautiful time. And so that's one of the things that even just with my dad, we could not have recreated, because my father did not grow up in McKee's Rocks.
Well,
and so
he
very
had memories, but I was able to say, oh, that was Jacob's Poultry. I was able to, strengthen them.
Yeah. And, the other part too, I think, as we were working on, we have an author's note in the very beginning of the book, because the book, if you just pick it up and you see that it's about my father, but it's written by two women, you don't really expect for the voice to just be a male's voice. So we felt like we needed a little explanation for that, and as did our editor as well.
Sure.
And so that opening author's note, I remember, I think the final paragraph, we talk about people's sensitivities, and that people are much more sensitive today than they were even, in the time that I grew up in the 80s and 90s. And I remember, and everything that Ruthie said about that paragraph was dead on. But I do remember that we did have some discussion around it, and we ended up softening it a little bit, and making it a little bit more accessible to now versus what people had thought about then. So that's one concrete example that I'm thinking of that kind of addresses your question. But again, it was all in love, and it all worked out beautifully, and the same thoughts and concepts were portrayed. It was just we took out a couple of things that were once in there and no longer. So we had a lot of those types of moments for sure.
Yeah, and I was curious if you could continue to elaborate a little bit more on this, because the character voice, the voice of your father, it has got to be, one of those things that needs time to go over and maybe rework or reshape as you're working on your drafts. So can you tell me a bit more, like on a technical level, how long it took to get that voice right? Because it's not an overnight decision of like, well, he needs to be softer, he needs to be kinder, or this or that. But when did you arrive at that? Because I'm curious how logistically you had to kind of like start going another direction with his voice.
I think it's almost a evolution that's still happening today.
Yeah.
He is a larger than life character, and he certainly is a character. So there are a lot of good news in that. And the good news from that is he's very easy to write because he's very black and white. And he has an answer for everything. And it's very simple. Like, I know, Ruthie and I talked about this a lot whenever we were writing it. Sometimes we would dream as him, or, think of, instead of what would Jesus do, it would be, what would Joe do in this situation? And, people have asked me straight up questions and said, oh, I wish that your dad was here right now to tell me why he ran for politics. And I said, well, I can tell you exactly why he ran for politics. From his perspective, even though it doesn't really make sense to the naked eye, he thought that all of the skills that he had in the restaurant could be easily transferable into the world of politics, and he would be able to, quote unquote, hit another home run. That's what he would probably say if he was on air right now. So I think because we lived his character for so long, there were some tense moments with him for sure. Because, as Ruthie said so beautifully in one of the opening scenes, our memories are very unreliable. And also, I think, part of, and please don't take offense to this, Jamie, but part of the whole macho male is that some of the stories and the things that he found terribly important did not at all drive the story forward. And some of those stories, in Ruthie and my opinion, should have been left on the cutting room floor. So there was one story in particular where we softened him a bit, but still showed his intensity. It happened in the kitchen. And he somehow, and again, we were going back and forth for 17 years, right? And we were very upfront with him. We sent him pages. I don't think that he always paid attention to what we were doing. But once it was sort of out and on paper, he read the version that is now the book, and he was incredibly upset about one story. And he gave this story way too much clout. It was a fine story. It showed the dark side of his personality, and that's what the intention of the story was. But it was not at all a pivotal moment in time. It could have easily showed up on the cutting room floor. And, he took the fact that we softened him as kind of a personal attack, in that we showed him as a quote unquote pushover, or it's not exactly how he would have wanted to be portrayed. But I said, you were enough of a jerk in this story that people are gonna understand that there's no need to throw 500 more F-bombs to make a point, even though that's maybe the way that the story went. We already get the point that you're angry and that you're yelling at somebody and that you're demeaning them and that this is a really tense moment. So it was things like that. I feel like because he's a character that you can write a book about, right? So people that are very even keel, lead very boring lives, they don't show up in books, or they don't show up as main characters in memoirs, I should say. So sometimes figuring out how to say things to him, sometimes making him understand the greater sense of the story Like another example, and then I'll stop talking and let Ruthie talk. But another example is the whole prison situation. That's a pivotal moment in the story. And whenever I had just written the story on my own, that really wasn't included, or, very lightly brushed past. And it took really having an honest discourse with him that now everything is quote unquote Googleable. So it's not if people are going to find this out, because it's public record. It's how do you want to write that narrative? How do you want to tell your side of the story? And once he understood that, then he opened up greatly, like almost too greatly. It felt like at times, like, we don't need this much information.
Sure.
But I'm gonna stop because I'm talking too much. I'm gonna let Ruthie talk a little bit.
Yeah, I think it was appropriate because you're setting the stage, and now Ruthie, I'm curious how you go about sort of finding these kinds of specific things to fix. And I think you're addressing something interesting about character, Maria, that you need to give him an arc. And I think that affects sort of the way that he behaves in certain scenes, if you will, quote unquote scenes, if you will. But Ruthie, could you elaborate a little bit more on that point of trying to find the right areas where you soften this character, or when does he need to go more, aggressive or more upfront about what his intentions are?
Right. So Joe wasn't as involved when we were writing at first. In the first iteration of the book, we actually sent out about 80 to agents and publishers. I knew, like, he's not telling the whole story. It's not only a male thing, it's a different generation male thing. I think, my sons, you, Jamie, you'd be a lot more willing to be vulnerable. That's the era we're in now. But Italian men of his generation, even worse, his father's generation, no, you did not talk about anything that you might not be happy that you did. You just didn't reveal it. And so in the first iteration, the end of the story was weaker because he didn't want to say how bad things had gotten. Also, it didn't include anything about his diabetes. And I had to say to him, that's really important. A lot of people have diabetes, so they can learn from that and they can relate to you more. There'll be a lot more readers relating to somebody with a chronic disease, things like that. Sometimes Maria would say, you talk to him because it's a lot easier with me than with your daughter. And sometimes I made those calls, and then he was able then to,
I think,
soften up about it.
Perhaps you were acting as the impartial, mediator who came in and said, let's think about it this way, right? It seems like that was happening a bit.
Right. But then when Maria said, anything you don't put in, the day the book comes out, someone's going to say, yeah, but he was in prison. Yeah, but he did this. So that's how she really convinced him. But both Joe and his wife, Donna, surprised us. They basically rewrote the last chapter.
Yeah.
At some point after the book had already had the full draft. So it strengthened the ending, and he just opened up a lot more. But I will say, whoever's listening, we're all unreliable narrators. It's unbelievable. I know how often I'm looking for a blue folder and it turns out it's yellow or whatever. But doing this story and trying to fact check and talk to families who were in there, no versions were exactly the same. So sometimes I'd say, well, we wrote this. Are you comfortable with this? Because Joe would remember things differently from the customer sometimes. So yeah, it really wasn't as hard as you might think to write in his voice. It's somehow over easier because we just know him well, and he has his ways and his sayings, and
right.
Yeah.
And it's the mark of a memorable human being, right? Somebody who is just so vividly articulating his real being that it just kind of sticks in your mind. And so I guess in terms of structure, I'm curious when you arrive at the form that you were working in now, because there is a bit of did you guys have flashback in there, or did you because you began with a story about the post delivering mail, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
how do you find the bookends? How do you get to those points where you have a solid structure that's going to jumpstart us into the book?
That's the back and forth, I think.
Yeah.
That's the
Yeah.
11,000 emails. If you open one of my cabinets, there's a stack about this high, just printed versions of the story. So there's just a lot of back and forth. And I always say, I'm still teaching, it's my 49th year.
Mm.
I always feel like writing's like a bad hair day. Like this side's fine, but right here, that's not the way I want it. And it's more a feel. This part of the story is working, this isn't. And I think a lot of that comes from being a reader more than just writing. I think the more you read, the more you pick up consciously or subconsciously, what's good and what isn't.
Yeah. Ruthie, did you have any difficulty switching hats from that of an educator to somebody who was a collaborator in this? Like, did you ever feel like you needed to create some distance between your different areas of life, or has that ever been an issue for you?
No, I have 4 other books, and I just was so busy with teaching that I'm an organist, and so I just didn't go through the process. Just in the earlier 2000s, when I went to a writing workshop, you needed a query letter and your manuscript. But now you need so much more. Just the book proposal was 50 some pages, and you have to do all kinds of research, and tell your first 2 pages have to be a combination of summary without giving away the ending, and sales. It just has to be like a sales piece, why this agent or publisher should pick up your book.
Sure.
But I'm straying a little from your question, Jamie. No, it's just all part. I always have something on my lap. If I'm not checking papers, I was writing other things, writing articles. I wrote an interdisciplinary unit for our amusement park, Kennywood in Pittsburgh. I did that in the 90s, and they gave that out to schools for their educational outreach. So no, I really enjoy writing. But I have to say, when school starts, I do get really involved in the kids' writing. And that's such a mission when you can teach someone to write and know that their lives are going to be easier because they can be trusted to correspond without supervision, that kind of thing. It gets addictive.
Yeah.
It just does. When you see the kids have a portfolio, you see from the beginning of the year to the end, you see the change. That's usually where my priority goes. And sometimes I know Maria was held up because I would prioritize school. And it felt like a pull for me sometime.
Yeah, and I'd like to ask the both of you, but maybe we'll begin with Maria. It seems like you're both very mission-oriented people. You're very conscious of the work that has to be done. And I imagine that this requires a lot of patience to collaborate on a project for this amount of time. Could you illustrate for us what that process was like? Because I think that in this day and age where the world is moving so quickly, there's so much that requires our attention. What was this process for you working on this for so long, and what kept you going together and staying focused on the mission?
So I think for me, this was not a simple process because whenever you get into the publishing world, this is one of those professions or industries that is not welcoming you with open arms. So you almost have to have a background in investigative journalism to just figure out how to move forward with the process, to figure out what the next steps should be. And so I think that my greatest struggle is, yes, the world moves at a very fast pace, but publishing moves at a glacial pace. And so matching those two things and being okay with not really knowing what the path was going to lead to, and knowing that you can put in 120% of the effort and wait a really long time and do everything quote unquote right, check all the boxes, and still be exactly where you were when you started out. The best way that I can illustrate this is we pretty much had the manuscript quote unquote done and in the beta reader's hands in the summer of 2020. We really started actively seeking agents in the winter of 21. And that process was completely daunting because first we had to figure out what it was that we needed in order to move forward with these agents, and then do a lot of research about agents that would be appropriate for our genre and who would have interest. And so that took quite a bit of time. And then sending out these query letters, and, it felt like sometimes you were sending things out into space, into an orbit that was completely unknown. And sometimes these things just stayed in that orbit. Like there are still, I want to say, 107 people that we've queried that still to this day have never even acknowledged that we did, not even said no, just nothing. And they're requesting, some of them were requesting a full manuscript, which in our case, that was around 90,000 words before some of those words got cut down in editing. The full proposal, which, as Ruthie had mentioned, was 50 plus pages with, 30 sample pages. And then we were working so hard trying to get some notoriety in the media and get covered because the restaurant was closed for 20 plus years. So we were up against that battle in saying, why would people be interested in a subject that's been out of the news for 20 plus years? Why is this the time? And then on top of that, trying to also convince people that this was not a local story, that this was a universal story that had elements of humanity and forgiveness and love and hope and resiliency, more than just this is a story of a restaurant that made it really big and then flopped. So those were just some of the things that we were up against. But, to this day, I'm always doing research on what's next in this process. I feel like where I will be with my next works and is further ahead in knowing what to expect. We really didn't have a great grasp on what this would entail. I had no idea how all-consuming this was going to be, especially 6 months leading up to the release of the book. And since the book has been released, it's been released now for 5 months. The amount of time and energy that's spent on just getting the word out and also proving why you're worthy to be on the shelf at bookstores, proving why you're somebody that should be in the limelight, even whenever, we've received a lot of really incredible accolades for the book and some awards, and we've been mentioned in national media. But even at that, I always say, okay, well, now that we've been mentioned in Forbes magazine, it's going to be so much easier. And it's not. So, that's where I think that it's, you don't know what you don't know until you know it.
Right.
And now that we know it, I think going forward on future projects, we at least have, and I'm assuming it's very similar like to a first year in teaching, right? Where you don't really know how it's all going to come together, and then it does. And then you have this model or this module that at least you kind of know what the timing is, you kind of know what the flow is. I would say that was the most frustrating and difficult piece for me. And it created a lot of dings to my self-esteem too, especially the ghosting portion of it. I actually used to be excited whenever we would get rejections, especially rejections that were very complimentary and very pointed, because I could tell that they A, read our work, and B, liked our work enough to give us some comments.
Yeah. Because it's information. It's feedback that you can continue to use as you move along, right?
Yeah, the ghosting was the hardest from
And
my perspective.
in society too. I don't understand why people think they don't need to reply, or they'll reply at their leisure these days. It's a problem. But I wanted to say, I think our biggest struggle was, again, we didn't know, and we applied to the memoir category. Well, we didn't realize that we're competing with all the celebrities and athletes and reality stars who had written their memoirs during the pandemic, just like we did. So that was the major reason for rejection. Joe wasn't a nationally recognized figure. People weren't going to go to the biography section and pull a book where they didn't even know the name. And that's what took so long. And then when the book came out, Amazon right away listed it on true crime. We didn't even consider that think about the genres. Probably we wouldn't have liked true crime because it's uncomfortable. We don't look at Joe as a criminal. We know all the good. He's my friend. He's her father, right? But I think that might help a new author. Or is there more than one genre where you could submit? Because a lot of books are across genres. That was our biggest obstacle.
Now, I'm glad that you mentioned some things that could be helpful to a new author, because I think it's a great opportunity, since I have the two of you here, to perhaps focus on things that would be beneficial for somebody who wants to write a project with a co-author. What are some things that you would impart to somebody who's starting, maybe not necessarily a memoir or, a true to life story, but even fiction? What are some essentials that collaborators need to make sure that the relationship gets off on the right foot?
I'll take that, Maria, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure.
we just treat each other with respect. It's not an effort. That's just what we do. We like each other, and we treat each other with love. And one recommendation I would have, I don't, I get nothing for endorsing, but there is a website called 16 Personalities. It's free to take the test, and it's based on the famous Myers-Briggs inventory. It gives you the same results with the same letters. And I like that, and I like Enneagrams, things that tell about personality types, and this is how to get along with a different personality, because we are also different. And it seems this decade now the world's angry about the differences. I mean, we used to we were in different political parties and didn't argue. It's just everybody's pointing fingers all the time and criticizing and rating. So 16 Personalities there are 16 basic types, and it says, how to get along with this type if you're this type. It's really fascinating, any of those things. And just last year, long after the process, Maria and I realized that we had the same personality code. And that's only 2% of the personalities have our personality. So I know in the Enneagrams, mine, I don't know what the title is for that, but in the Enneagrams, mine translates to helper. And I think that's both kind of our personalities, and I can't discount that in getting along. But by looking at those kinds of things, I learned more about getting along with other people. That's just, you don't take it personally. They're different from you. So I think starting that, there are going to be differences, absolutely. Maybe even, I don't know, it works so naturally with us, but maybe you'd even have to set norms. This is ahead of time. There are going to be differences, so how will we handle them and stay friends?
Set the ground rules.
And it was pretty effortless with us, yeah.
Yeah. What do you think, Maria?
I think exactly what Ruthie said about starting and leading with respect is really important. The other thing that I would add to that is we all have strengths, and we all have things that maybe we're not as strong in. If you can identify that quickly and own it and also kind of rely on your partner to take over the things that maybe are their strengths, but not yours, I think it creates a really nice symbiotic relationship too. Whenever Ruthie is definitely the grammar person between the two of us, like without a doubt. But I'm definitely very aggressive and very much a marketing mind. So whenever we're doing things, I'm always thinking, okay, how can we've sort of exhausted this opportunity. How do we spin this and kind of keep it alive?
Mm-hmm.
And now what do we do? Like even just the launch party. So we threw a huge launch party 2 days before the book came out at the Heinz History Center. And really how that started, I thought, oh, it would be really nice to have a celebration in Pittsburgh for this book before it came out. Well, I went, I think around Thanksgiving time, a year before the book came out. The book was set to come out in August. And just like hosting a wedding or a special event, I just went to different venues and just looked around. And I fell in love with the Heinz History Center because it's the Smithsonian Museum of Pittsburgh, and there are lots of Pittsburgh history, including all the Heinz ketchup bottles and Kennywood, our amusement park, and many sports figures and lots of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania history. And also my dad had archives at the museum from whenever he was in the restaurant. So it just seemed like the best fit, but it also came with the heftiest price tag. And as you know, Jamie, being a writer that has not yet released anything, it comes with really large dollar signs, right? Like you get really, really wealthy. No. I'm totally kidding. Not at all. It's really much more of you putting a lot of, backing into making things the way that you need to have them. And so whenever I approached the Heinz History Center about their price tag, instead of kind of coming from a place of begging, I came from a place of partnership. And I said, hey, listen, there's no doubt you guys are Pittsburgh's museum, but I think of this story as Pittsburgh's story. And I'm wondering if there's a way that we might be able to partner together for the mutual benefit of both of us. And whenever you frame something like that, it gets people thinking. And guess what? They were open to that conversation. And that's exactly what happened. And not only did it lead to a wonderful partnership, and they, provided 50% of the funds to throw this amazing 500 plus invite only launch party for us, but they still to this day carry our book in their bookstore. They've become a distributor for some other local places in Pittsburgh. We were noted, we had a pre-release with them, an exclusive pre-release. So our book really didn't go out for pre-release until May on Amazon. In the middle of March, we started selling at the Heinz History Center. The Heinz History Center alone, just on our launch day, sold like 500 books just on just at our launch party. Plus, they had pre-orders of people that were out of town, that could receive signed copies. So, I'm not saying that you have to have this huge launch party in whatever area that you live in, but just kind of thinking creatively about how, like, what you bring to the table and how you can partner with people to mutually serve everybody's benefit. Looking at things like that. I mean, I'm always thinking very creatively. And most of the times whenever I even approach things, I think, it's probably not going to work. But if I don't try it, I'm never going to know if it does. And sometimes it surprises you because sometimes it does.
Absolutely. And I love that you're bringing it back to community, because initially we talk of like, how can we sell the story? How can it be a big, massive national or international thing? But I love that bringing it back to community is sometimes the answer, where if that is your root, if that is really the strength of the story, why not go from there, make it super specific, and then build from there? And in terms of marketing, I just feel like that's something that we don't really talk about, because a lot of authors don't have the I guess the means, or perhaps don't have a way into that kind of thinking. So I'm curious if you folks could elaborate a little bit more on that. Tips to get this thing out into the world by leveraging community, because that's such a great sort of sentiment, I feel, and something that a lot of writers could benefit from, especially independent artists.
So one of the things that I would start with is, especially if you're a nonfiction author, you're going to need a book proposal, which Ruthie, briefly explained, which is basically your business plan for the book. And there's a whole section on your audience and marketing. So really, one very simple way to start is just by brainstorming. Throw every single possible connection. Where did you go to school? Where do you work? Where are you from? Anything on the paper. And then that's the blueprint for how you start building out that marketing plan. How can you leverage the alumni associations that you're involved with? And in my case, I went to Syracuse University, and they have a pretty popular podcast for Syracuse alumni. And Syracuse is a really big media school. And so a good friend of mine who works for CNBC actually pitched me to Syracuse to be on that podcast. And, this is a podcast over time, they've interviewed Marv Albert. They interviewed Joe Biden, who was a Syracuse alum. They've interviewed Jim Boeheim, who was the basketball coach for 40 or 50 plus years and very, very well known. So lots of Bob Costas, lots of very, very well known names. But it was about that personal community connection. Hey, I went to Syracuse. This is a project that I'm working on. This is why I think it could be a benefit to your specific audience. So instead of coming from a point, I think I had just said this too, of begging people, you have to tell people why you're an asset to them. You should, if you're going to go on a podcast, don't just go on a podcast to go on a podcast. Make sure that you're in line with the mission of that podcast, and make sure that you go on to that podcast. I just watched something recently that I think was really poignant. When you go and do anything in the media, do it from a point of service, not a point of sales. Okay. So what I mean by that is, if we would come on here and just constantly, our book is this and this, and okay, let's get back to talking about the book and this and this and this and this, like, you're going to tune it out within 5 seconds. But if you come on thinking, okay, if I was sitting in the shoes of the people that are listening right now, what would I need to or like to hear? What would be worth it to my time? Because time is money, right? And it's a very, very valuable thing. So think of it that way whenever you approach these organizations or people that you want to partner with or leverage. Think of what you could give to them, because that's really what it's all about. And whenever you switch your mindset just slightly, you would be surprised with the things that happen as a result to it. That's kind of the advice that I would impart.
That's awesome.
Absolutely. I want to add something, though. Things I didn't know. You are the marketer. I thought if you get a publisher, you write the book and then that's it. Oh, you're also the proofreader for the printer. When they say, which happened to be the night I had surgery, there came the manuscript. I didn't even get to take a tramadol. We had to get right on it. But you're that. But for marketing, we even had to contact all the libraries in Pittsburgh. We had to approach, unfortunately, it's not just one buyer. There's so much you have to do in the marketing. And we read that Only 5% of authors ever sell more than 5,000 books, and 95% don't. And that's not that many books. And I realize now it's because you have to do the constant marketing. The other thing I think really important to say to new authors that I didn't know, the big publishers all want you to have an agent. Many, when I've had the writers' guides for 20 years, and it's changed. It's not submit here. They'll tell you, oh, this publisher will do 14 mysteries a year, or they will do 3 cookbooks, because they budget their staff and their money for that. So they tell you in that way what to expect, but it's no longer submit. It says agent only, agent only. Most of the places you'd want to see, there are other paths. I mean, a lot of people self-publish now, and occasionally a self-published book is a huge seller. But whether you self-publish or find it, go to a publisher, you need an agent. And so that was costly during the pandemic. You're not going to go out. We didn't really know any agents. So mostly Maria would attend conferences. And at the end of the conference, you can pitch to agents. Again, it probably wouldn't be as hard, except that we were in the memoir category. But just, I didn't know that. So that's what somebody needs to know. Either way, whether you have a publisher or you self-publish, marketing is the way the book gets sold. You can't really let down.
That's right. So I just got to tell you folks, this has been amazing. I have one more question here. I've been on this kick recently in this last year of speaking about a life well lived, whether that means in conjunction with writing or about writing. And I'm curious, in this special episode about collaboration, what does this partnership bring you in terms of having a life well lived? And what do we have to learn from this kind of collaboration for any creative? Whoever wants to go.
I'll let you go first, Ruthie.
For me, it's not about the book being popular. It's about the relationship I had with Maria. It's just that, hey, we did it. We wrote a book together. And the comments that come, the heartwarming comments, are like when a former student shows up at the book signing, or people tell us what the joy they had from the restaurant. Or it's more in relationships and connections. It's not, hey, I want to be famous. Here's my book. That's my name. Not at all. It's the little things. And the biggest compliment I think I could ever have as an English teacher, one respected critic said that we disrupted the genre by having this genre, a man's voice, with 2 women authors. And that was like, hey, that's the biggest compliment. Tell someone they disrupted a genre, will be the Wally Lamb of the opposite gender. If you read a Wally Lamb book, you can't believe how he understands females. But, it's the little things. It's being on here. It's meeting you, Jamie. It really is. Those are the joys. And, certainly not the money. it's not. Don't write a book to get rich.
And I would say for me, it's just been about this really fantastic journey. For 17 years, it always hung over my head a little bit that I didn't get this accomplished. I'm a person that just puts sometimes really big, lofty goals in my mind and then finds a way to do it. I ran 2 marathons. I don't have an athletic bone in my body. I did not run track. I was always the kid that was picked last for gym before that was not allowed to be happening anymore. So for me, just knowing that I had this hanging over my head and I never did it. And especially, I guess the more heartwarming piece of the story is that my dad was not well throughout a lot of the process, like really not well. For probably around those pandemic years, he had had not 1, but 2 kidney transplants, kidney failure that had led to sepsis and C. diff and a urinary tract infection that all kind of came together, 50 days hospitalized, another transplant, which ended in him being in a medically induced coma for a week because of a poor drug interactions. So for me, being able to see this process through with Ruthie has been so amazing, because it's, 365 degrees of our relationship kind of coming to life. And it's been a beautiful process, but also knowing that my dad's able to see it. For the longest time, I thought, at least we'll be able to memorialize this story. And now to see that my dad is living it. And, just to put it into a quick perspective, for a very long time, we were that family that everybody sort of looked up to in the neighborhood. We were that hub where people would come to celebrate all of their wins. And, sometimes whenever things were hard, they would come to us too. And then whenever that was all stripped away and my dad went to prison, we sort of lost that ability to be charitable within the community. And that was something that really fuels my father in particular. And we became the people that were once always sought out, to the people that, we would go places and sometimes you could hear people whispering, right? Like we were not getting invitations for dinners or anything like that, because whenever you're in trouble or whenever you have a little dark cloud over your head, nobody wants to associate with you because they're afraid that they're going to be next. It's just human nature. And so to see this now come full circle, my dad has such a full life of social activities now. He is in the media, and sometimes he talks about this book like he was the one that wrote it. And I don't think Ruthie or I care at all. I think that we just think it's a beautiful, wonderful thing, that he could experience so much joy in some moments for many, many years whenever things were so not good. So I, just have always an attitude of gratitude and being so grateful to be able to share these wonderful moments. Whenever, the book had come out, in that 1 week, the book came out, my dad turned 70 and Ruthie turned 70. It was just such an amazing week of just celebration and renewal and hope and wonder. And I feel like we're still living that every day. Every day is a surprise. Like, holy crap, what just happened? I have to pinch myself sometimes and make sure that I'm not dreaming. So, just very grateful. Anybody that's listening that has supported us or that will continue to support us, thank you. Whenever you review the book, it's like you give us a little hug, especially if you like the book, even if you just say it was a great book. These are the moments that I live for as a writer, and that I'll remember for many, many years to come.
Oh, that's wonderful to hear. And I think that's a powerful note to end on. But Maria, Ruthie, I can't thank you enough for sharing so much about this beautiful collaborative relationship, and of course, to give us a little bit more insight on the book On the Rocks, which is a deeply, deeply impactful story that is not only local and specific, but something that will cater to a lot of folks, including us out here in the Western Plains. So I really can't thank you enough. You're wonderful, and I hope that we can chat again down the road anytime. Yes. The door's always open at Arts Calling for you.
Thank you. We would love that.
Anytime.
Thank you, Jamie.
I'll let you folks enjoy your Sunday, but I really appreciate it. I will be in touch real soon on the internet.
Perfect. Okay. Thanks, Jamie.
Thanks again,
All right,
folks.
have a great Sunday.
Have a wonderful time.
Bye.
Bye.
Okay, bye.